She arrived on a Tuesday. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows in Harrowfield, Oklahoma territory, a town that had long decided Tuesdays were her quiet things, for mending fences and ironing Sunday shirts and doing nothing worth talking about until supper. But on this particular Tuesday in the autumn of 1897, something happened that Harrowfield would spend the next 50 years trying to explain to its grandchildren. A woman stepped down from the afternoon stage, and she was wearing red. Not a whisper of red, not a polite blush at the collar or a modest ribbon at the wrist. No, this was a deep, unapologetic, stop everything you are doing and look at me red. Her traveling coat was the color of autumn leaves at their most defiant hour, and she wore it like a woman who had earned the right to be seen. The town of Harrowfield stopped breathing. Agnes Turnbow, who ran the seamstress shop on Main Street and had appointed herself the moral conscience of the entire county, pressed a hand to her bosom and said, loudly enough for God and everyone to hear, "Well, I never." Mayor Horace Clendon, who had been standing outside the post office with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and a satisfied look on his face, the look of a man expecting a veterinarian and a doctor to arrive and solve all his town's problems, felt his satisfaction drain away like water through cracked earth. And Matthias Decker, the blacksmith, who had been crossing the street with a length of iron chain slung over his shoulder and absolutely no interest in anything the afternoon stage had to offer, stopped walking. He could not have explained why. He simply stopped. He looked at the woman in red. She looked at Harrowfield. And somehow, in that single glance, she seemed to take the measure of the whole town, its dust and its pride and its stubbornness and its fear, and find it both wanting and possibly worth the trouble. Her brother stepped down behind her, black bag in hand, and she turned and took the second black bag, the larger one, the one stamped D.R.E. Hargrove, M.D., and settled it firmly in her grip. "Silas," she said quietly, "I believe we've arrived." "I believe," said her brother, surveying the frozen street with a mild, amused expression, "that they are aware." What followed would tear Harrowfield apart, knit it back together, break one very proud man completely open, and leave the whole town on its knees, some in outrage, and some, eventually, in gratitude. This is the story of Dr. Eden Hargrove, the woman who came to heal a town that did not know it was sick, and of Matthias Decker, iron-willed, iron-handed, iron-hearted, who was her first patient, her fiercest enemy, and the last man on earth she expected to love. Friends, if this story already has your heart beating a little faster, do not go anywhere. Subscribe to the Blessed Christian Storyteller right now. Tap that button, ring that bell, because we are just getting started, and I promise you, this story will not let you go until its final word. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that God can use the most unlikely people in the most unlikely places to do the most beautiful things. Now, let us go to Harrowfield. Harrowfield, Oklahoma territory, had been without a doctor for 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. They knew this with the precision of people who had lost someone to that absence. Old Doc Prescott, Dr. Wendell Prescott, who had delivered half the town and set the other half's broken bones, had died of a heart seizure the previous September, slumped over his desk with a half-eaten biscuit in his hand and a look of mild surprise on his face, as though death had been impolite enough to arrive before he was finished eating. The town had mourned him deeply, then it had mourned his absence with a practicality born of necessity. 3 children had been lost that winter to fevers that a competent physician might have caught in time. A rancher named Briggs had lost 2 fingers to a wound that turned septic before anyone could think what to do about it. The midwife, old Clotilda, had done her best, but she was 72, and her best, God bless her, was not always enough. So when Mayor Clendon had received word, in the form of a letter on fine paper, that the Hargrove siblings, one veterinarian, one physician, were willing to relocate to Harrowfield and hang their shingles on the same building, he had responded with the speed that would have been embarrassing if anyone had been watching. He had written back, "We will provide housing, a proper surgery, and a livery fee for the first year. Harrowfield is a growing community of God-fearing, decent people who, I assure you, will treat your professionals with the utmost respect and appreciation." What he had assumed, what the whole town had assumed, because some assumptions are so deeply embedded in the furniture of a man's mind that he does not know they are there until someone tries to move them, was that the physician would be a man. The letter said Dr. E. Hargrove. E could stand for Edward, or Elias, or Ezekiel, or even Ernest, which was not a fine name, but at least a man's name. It had not apparently occurred to Mayor Clendon that E could stand for Eden. He would spend a great deal of time in the coming weeks thinking about that particular oversight. The morning of the stage's arrival, Main Street had worn a festive air. Ruth Clendon, the mayor's wife, a small, precise woman with quick eyes and a quicker mind that she had learned in 20 years of marriage to keep mostly to herself, had organized a small, welcoming delegation. There were flowers in a jar outside the clinic, which occupied the old mercantile building, freshly whitewashed. There was a banner above the door, painted by the school children, that read, "Welcome, Doctors Hargrove." Pastor Elias Webb, a lean, gray-eyed man of 50 who had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to those who have learned to listen before they speak, stood near the back of the little crowd with his hands clasped behind him and a look of thoughtful anticipation on his face. Agnes Turnbow had dressed in her best visiting dress, not for the doctors, she would tell anyone who asked, but simply because she had happened to be walking past when the stage was due. And Matthias Decker, as has been established, had been crossing the street with no particular interest in any of it. He was that kind of man, the kind who moves through a crowd the way a boulder sits in a river. The current goes around him, and he does not notice the current at all. He was 34 years old, broad across the chest and shoulders in the way that comes not from vanity, but from years of honest, punishing labor. He had dark hair that wanted cutting, and dark eyes that wanted softening, and a jaw that had been described at various times as firm, unyielding, stubborn as a Missouri mule, and, by one woman who had briefly entertained romantic notions before thinking better of them, sculptured, though she had not said that to his face. He was, by the consensus of Harrowfield, a fine blacksmith and a difficult man. The two qualities had always seemed, to the town, to be related. He had stopped walking when the woman in red stepped off the stage, for reasons he would have struggled and failed to articulate, and which he would have denied strenuously if pressed. He watched her take the second black bag. He watched her straighten her spine. It was already straight, but she straightened it further, the way a person does when they are preparing for a fight they have been in before. He heard her quiet word to her brother. He saw Mayor Clendon's expression collapse, and he felt in the very center of his chest a sensation he had no name for and no patience with, which he immediately attributed to the fact that he had skipped his midday meal and gone back to the forge too quickly. He shifted the chain on his shoulder. He kept walking, or he tried to. Mayor Clendon was not by nature an unkind man. This is important to say, because what followed was not the work of cruelty, but the work of a smaller thing, a thing that is in some ways more dangerous than cruelty, because it is harder to confront and harder to name. It was the work of assumption, of a world that had arranged itself in his mind in a particular order, and the violence of being asked to rearrange it. "Miss Hargrove," he said, stepping forward with his hand extended, his voice finding its mayor's register, warm, authoritative, the voice of a man in charge. "Welcome to Harrowfield, and you must be—" He turned to Silas, expecting to shake the hand of a physician. "Dr. Eden Hargrove," said Eden, and took his extended hand firmly before he could redirect it. "Physician and surgeon, and this is my brother, Dr. Silas Hargrove, your new veterinarian." She shook his hand with the brisk confidence of someone who has done this exact thing many times before and has long since ceased to find it amusing. Mayor Clendon's mouth opened. Mayor Clendon's mouth closed. Ruth Clendon, standing 2 steps behind her husband, looked at Eden Hargrove, at the steadiness of her gaze, the set of her chin, the quiet readiness in her posture, and felt something loosen in her own chest. A knot she had not known was there. "A woman," said Agnes Turnbow, loudly from the crowd. "Yes," said Eden pleasantly, "quite thoroughly." A ripple went through the gathered townsfolk, a sound compounded of surprise and discomfort, and, in 1 or 2 cases, a quickly suppressed laugh. Silas, beside his sister, had the expression of a man who loves the person he is standing next to and has learned that the best thing he can do for her is to stand still and let her handle her own battles, which she is entirely capable of doing. Pastor Webb, at the edge of the crowd, tilted his head slightly. He was watching not the town's reaction to Eden, but Eden's response to the town, and what he saw interested him considerably. "Mayor Clendon," Eden said, her voice still pleasant, still steady, "I understand this may not be what you were expecting. I found that's often the way. If you'll show me to the clinic, I'd like to assess what we're working with and get settled before dark. I've had a long journey, and I expect your town needs a doctor rather more than it needs a discussion about my qualifications. A beat. Though I'm happy to have that discussion too, if you'd prefer. I graduated first in my class from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. I trained under Dr. Anna Walters at Philadelphia General for 3 years. I have certificates and letters of recommendation in my bag. But perhaps we could start with the clinic." There was a silence. The kind of silence that a town makes when it is recalibrating. Mayor Clendon looked at her. He looked at the bag with her name on it. He looked at the banner the children had painted, "Welcome Doctors Hargrove," and for a moment Eden thought she saw something shift behind his eyes. Not acceptance, not yet, but something more honest than the refusal she had feared. "This way, Miss Dr. Hargrove," he said at last. It was not a welcome, but it was a door, and Eden Hargrove had long since learned that doors were enough to start with. She walked through it. She was aware, as she followed the mayor down Main Street, of eyes on her back, some hostile, some curious, some carefully neutral. She was aware of Agnes Turnbow's stage whisper to the woman next to her, "A woman doctor, playing at doctoring, as if it's some kind of game." She was aware of a group of men outside the hardware store who stopped talking when she passed and did not resume until she had rounded the corner. She was also aware of Matthias Decker. He was not looking at her, or rather he was conspicuously not looking at her, which was itself a kind of looking. He had planted himself against the post outside his blacksmith shop, arms folded, chain still on his shoulder, watching the ground or the middle distance or some point in the air that was specifically not in her direction. He was very large and very still, the way things are still when they are under tension. She did not know his name yet. She did not know anything about him except that he was the kind of man who made himself present by refusing to be present, and that his not looking at her had more weight to it than most people's direct stares. She filed it away. She had a clinic to examine. The clinic was better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped. Doc Prescott had been a good physician for his time and his tools, which meant he was adequate by the standards of 1878. Eden was working with the standards of 1897, and the gap between those 2 decades in medicine was considerable. The surgical table was solid oak, which was good. The instruments had been cleaned and laid out, which showed respect, though some of them were so outdated that they would need to be replaced. There was a proper examining room, a small surgery, and a dispensary with more gaps on its shelves than medicines upon them. There was also a back room with a cot, which seemed to be Doc Prescott's habit, sleeping near his patients when needed. Eden approved of this habit. "It's workable," she told Silas that evening as they sat in the small kitchen of the house the town had provided, a 2-story frame house on Birch Street, modest and clean, with a good wood stove and a porch that caught the evening breeze. "High praise," said Silas, who had spent the afternoon surveying the animal hospital situation, which was in a converted stable 2 streets over, and was, by his estimation, more workable than Eden's clinic by a factor of approximately 3.
I'll need carbolic acid in quantity, proper suture materials, chloroform, their supply is almost gone, a new trephine, and someone is going to teach these people about boiling water. She paused. And they need to stop using lard on burns. How long do you give it, Silas said carefully, before the mayor asks you to leave? Eden looked at her tea. He already had the conversation with me this afternoon. Politely, he suggested that while my qualifications were no doubt very fine, the people of Harrowfield might be more comfortable with... She stopped. A man, said Silas. He said a doctor with a more traditional practice. She met her brother's eyes. I told him that I had not come all the way from Philadelphia to turn around and that the town's comfort was less of a medical priority than their health and that I would be opening my doors at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did he say to that?" He said he supposed that was that. "Well, it is rather that," Silas said. Eden smiled, a small, private smile, the kind that lives in the corners of the mouth and belongs to the person wearing it. "It is rather that," she agreed. Outside, the Oklahoma Territory night had settled in, vast and dark and full of stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Closer by, the rhythmic sound of the blacksmith's hammer rang out, late, impossibly late, the kind of work that a man does because he cannot stop, because the iron needs him, or because he needs the iron. Eden listened to it for a moment, then she finished her tea, checked her instrument case, and went to bed. On the first day, no one came. Eden sat in her clinic from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, organized her dispensary, cataloged her instruments, made a list of supplies she would need to order from the city, and read 3 chapters of a surgical textbook she had brought with her. Silas came by at noon with sandwiches and a look of carefully managed sympathy. The welcome flowers outside the door, she noticed, had been moved to the other side of the street. On the second day, Ruth Clendon arrived. She arrived at 9:30, wearing a plain dress and a determined expression, and she announced that she had a headache that had been troubling her for 3 weeks. Eden examined her carefully. Headache was too vague a word for what she found, which was a woman of 43 who had been under significant stress, whose blood pressure was elevated, who was not sleeping enough, and who had been prescribed laudanum by the late Doc Prescott at a rate that Eden considered distinctly inadvisable. "I'm reducing your laudanum, gradually, I won't stop it suddenly, but I want you sleeping, truly sleeping, not medicated into unconsciousness. The difference matters more than you know. I'm also prescribing rest, and by rest I mean that you will do less, Mrs. Clendon, not simply perform your obligations in a more tired state." Ruth looked at her, a long look, measured and careful. "You are not like Doc Prescott." "No," Eden agreed. "He never told me what anything meant. He gave me the medicine and said it would help." "I believe you deserve to understand what is happening in your own body," Eden said quietly. "I believe that's your right as a patient and as a person." Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'll tell my husband you treated me. I would appreciate that. He won't be happy." "No, but you will eventually feel better. That seems like the more important consideration." Ruth left. She did not smile exactly, but something in her face had changed. The rigid, careful blankness of a woman managing a public role had cracked just slightly around the edges. On the third day, 3 people came. A young mother with a child whose croup had worsened overnight. Eden managed it in 20 minutes with a steam tent and cool air and the application of calm, practical reassurance that the child was not dying, just frightened and miserable, and that there was a difference. A farmhand with a wound on his forearm that had begun to suppulate, Eden cleaned it properly, applied fresh dressings, and told him plainly that if he had waited another 3 days, he would have lost his arm. He had not been to the clinic before this because he had not been sure the lady doctor would know what she was about. He was sure now. He said so to his employer, who told his neighbor, who told 2 people at the general store.
The third person was Pastor Elias Webb, who came with no apparent ailment, settled into the patient's chair, and said, "I have come to make your acquaintance properly, Dr. Hargrove, without the town watching." "I appreciate that," said Eden. She poured him coffee. It was the only hospitality she could offer, but she offered it sincerely. "You will have a hard time of it here," the pastor said, not cruelly, as a man states a mathematical fact. "I'm aware." Harrowfield is not a bad town. It is a frightened one, and frightened people dress their fear as principle. Eden looked at him. That is a more perceptive observation than I expected from a welcome visit. Something very close to a smile moved across the pastor's lean face. "I have been pastor here for 15 years. I have had a long time to observe the difference between what people say and what they mean." He set down his coffee. "I will not interfere in the town's decision about you. That would not be appropriate. But I will tell you this. I think you were sent here. I say that not as flattery, but as my best understanding of how Providence tends to arrange itself. The people of this town need not only physical healing, Dr. Hargrove. They need the kind that comes when pride is broken gently open. I suspect you may be the instrument for that, whether any of us are ready or not." Eden sat with that for a moment. "And if they run me out first?" "Then the Lord will have to arrange a different instrument," said Pastor Webb serenely, "but I do not think they will." He left. Eden sat alone in her clinic as the afternoon light slanted through the windows and felt something she had not felt in the 3 days since her arrival, the faint, stubborn warmth of hope. It was the following Monday when Matthias Decker's anvil tried to kill him. Not the anvil precisely. The more accurate account, the one Matthias would have given if he had been the type of man who gave accounts of himself, involved a length of iron being worked at high heat. A moment of inattention, he would have called it something else. Inattention implied vulnerability, and Matthias Decker did not do vulnerability. And the edge of a partially formed horseshoe rebounding at an angle that physics had conspired to make maximally unfortunate. It caught him across the left forearm and the side of his hand with a glancing blow. Not catastrophic, not enough to drop him, but enough to leave a deep gash along the forearm that bled with the single-minded generosity of a man with a healthy heart and strong circulation, which Matthias certainly had, and enough to leave a burn beneath the cut, where the hot metal had kissed the skin on its way past. He pressed a rag against it. He held it. He finished the horseshoe, because the horse it was intended for was waiting in the yard, and Matthias Decker did not leave things undone. Then he looked at his arm and concluded that it probably needed attention. His plan, insofar as it could be called a plan, was to stop by the mercantile for some clean cloth and do the job himself. He had done it before. He was not afraid of blood, particularly his own. He had a wife once, briefly, who had been afraid of blood, and had for a while missed the idea of her, but that was a different thing. He did not intend to go to the clinic. He would later blame the blood loss. It was a reasonable explanation, and he was going to stick to it, for the fact that when he turned the corner toward the mercantile, he found himself facing the clinic instead. The door was open, the freshly swept steps lay across the morning light, and standing in the doorway, reading something with the focused intensity of a person who reads not for entertainment, but for information, was Dr. Eden Hargrove. She looked up. She looked at his arm. "In," she said. It was not a request. "I was going to the mercantile." "The mercantile," said Eden in a tone of professional flatness that he would come to know well, "does not have carbolic acid, a curved needle, or the particular kind of suture that will give that wound the best chance of closing cleanly. I do." She stepped back from the doorway. "In." He stood on the steps for a moment. He was, she noticed, even larger up close, the kind of large that registers not just visually, but as a kind of atmospheric pressure, a sense that the air rearranges itself around him. He had blood soaking through his rag on his arm at a rate that suggested the situation was less minor than his expression implied, and his expression implied that nothing about this situation was of any particular concern to him. "I don't need a doctor. Particularly," he added, with a bluntness that was apparently as involuntary as breathing, "this one." Eden let the pause sit. It was a skill she had developed over years, the ability to let a silence speak before she did. Then she said, quietly and with perfect steadiness, "Sit down, Mr. Decker, Matthias Decker." Mr. Decker, sit down. That wound requires suturing, and that burn requires proper dressing. If you walk away now, the wound will close poorly, if it closes, and the burn site will be vulnerable to infection that will make your next several weeks very unpleasant. I am not asking you to like me or to think well of female physicians. I am asking you to sit in that chair and let me do my job, which I am very good at. A pause. You may continue to disapprove of me while I sew you up. I won't mind. Something moved across his face. She couldn't quite name it. It was not quite humor, but it was adjacent to humor. The reluctant, unwilling reaction of a person who is confronted with something they can't comfortably dismiss. He sat down. Not happily, not graciously. He lowered himself into the examination chair like a man who is making clear that he is choosing to do this and is not being compelled, and retains the right to change his mind, and is definitely not going to thank anyone for any of this. Eden was already at her instrument cabinet. She was efficient, he would give her that. He sat with his forearm on the examination table and watched her work. He told himself he was watching her work because he was the kind of man who paid attention to craftsmanship in all its forms, and not for any other reason. And what he saw was a person who moved with the particular economy of someone who has performed a task hundreds of times and has stripped it of all unnecessary motion. She cleaned the wound without comment and without flinching, which was more than could be said for his usual response to carbolic acid. She probed the depth of the gash with a gentleness that he resented slightly, because it was more gentle than he had expected, and that had disrupted a mental model he had constructed and preferred. 14 stitches, she said. Do what you need to do. I'll use a curved needle. The scar will be smaller than if I used a straight one. She threaded the needle with movements so practiced they barely needed attention. The burn is 2nd degree. I'm going to dress it with clean linen and a preparation that will help it heal without blistering further. I need you to keep it dry for at least 5 days. I'm a blacksmith. I'm aware of that. You'll need to modify your work accordingly. I have orders. Mr. Decker, she met his eyes directly, a directness that he found was somewhat difficult to look away from. I understand that your work is important to you. It is also true that if you don't allow this to heal properly, you risk permanent damage to the nerve pathways here. She indicated a section of his forearm, which would affect the grip of this hand, your dominant hand, I assume. He was silent. Your work requires that hand. 5 days of modified labor is not a sacrifice. It is an investment. He said nothing, but he did not argue further, which she took as compliance. She began to suture. He was, she noted professionally, an excellent patient in the sense that he held completely still and made no sound. Not the grim, cheese-clenching silence of someone performing stoicism, but the genuine, unfussed stillness of someone for whom pain is simply a condition of existence and is not worth performing about. She found, expectedly, that she respected this. You're the blacksmith, she said, making conversation not from social habit, but from the clinical observation that patients who talk sometimes manage pain better. You've established that. You were out late last Monday. I could hear the hammer. She placed a stitch, drew it through. Does your forge run that late often? He looked at her. You were listening. I was trying to sleep. My windows face that direction. A pause. Then, almost against his apparent will, I had a wagon wheel to finish for the Aldred family. Their boy, Tommy, he's been poorly this fall, and they needed the wagon to get to the circuit preachers' meeting in Breckenridge. I told them I'd have it by morning. Eden placed another stitch. The boy, Tommy, how old? 8, 9, maybe. A pause. He's a good boy.
There was something in the way he said it that made Eden set down her needle for just a fraction of a second. Not long enough for him to notice, she hoped, because the voice of a difficult man saying a small, quiet, tender thing about a child has a particular quality that goes in under the ribs. What's been wrong with him? She asked, resuming her work. Chest, coughs at night. His mother keeps asking me, he stopped. Asking you, nothing. It's not my business to say. She finished the last stitch. 12, 13, 14, tied the thread with the precise, practiced movements that she sometimes thought must look like magic to people who had not seen them 1,000 times. She began to dress the burn. If the boy's mother wants to bring him in, Eden said carefully, I'd be glad to see him. She might not think it's appropriate? Eden kept her voice even. Matthias Decker looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light from the clinic window lay across the table between them, and in it she could see the lines of his face clearly. Not handsome exactly, or not only that, but carved with the particular depth of a face that has spent a great deal of time set against difficult things. There was something behind his eyes that she could not quite read. Not hostility exactly, something more complicated than hostility. I'll tell her you said that, he said finally. Good. She tied the last bandage. 5 days light work. Come back Thursday so I can check the stitches. She stepped back. That will be $1.50. He paid without argument. He took his hat from the hook by the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his back to her, a large dark outline against the bright street, and she thought he was going to say something. She waited. He left without saying it. Eden stood alone in her clinic and looked at the 4 drops of blood on her examination table and the 14 pieces of thread that had held a difficult man together, and thought about small boys who coughed at night. It was Agnes Turnbow who gave the opposition its voice. She was not a malicious woman. This also needs to be said. She was a frightened woman with a great deal of social investment in the existing order of things, and she had the particular talent, common to people who have turned fear into habit, of finding the most resonant possible form for what she wanted to say and saying it in the most public possible forum. What she said, 3 weeks after Eden's arrival at the ladies' auxiliary meeting, was this: a woman playing at being a doctor is not the same as a doctor. It is a dangerous pretense, and when she makes a mistake, because she will make a mistake, being neither trained in the ways of Providence nor suited by nature for the work, it will be one of our children who pays for it. It was not an argument that required evidence. It was an argument that required only fear, and fear was a commodity Harrowfield had in sufficient supply. By the end of the week, a petition had circulated, 19 signatures requesting that the town council rescind the agreement with Dr. Eden Hargrove and seek a male physician to take her place. The petition was presented to Mayor Clendon on the town council meeting on a Friday evening, and Eden was not present because no one had thought to tell her about it. It was Silas who heard. He came to her that night with the expression of a man delivering bad news that he would have preferred to deliver differently but cannot find a better way. How many signatures? Eden asked. 19. And how many people are in Harrowfield? 312, according to the last census. She sat with this. What did the mayor say? That he would take it under consideration. Silas paused. Ruth Clendon reportedly left the meeting early. Unusually early. Eden was quiet for a long time. The night outside was dark, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled, and somewhere across town, incredibly, the blacksmith's hammer was going again, that steady, patient, unavoidable rhythm that she had begun, without entirely meaning to find oddly comforting. What are you thinking? Silas asked. I'm thinking, said Eden slowly, that I have been practicing medicine for 6 years. I'm thinking that I have sat with dying patients and frightened mothers and men who didn't believe I knew what I was doing until I did it in front of them. I'm thinking that every single time, without exception, the problem was not my competence, but their comfort, and that those two things are not equivalent. She looked at her hands. I am not leaving. I know, said Silas. I am going to that meeting next week. I am going to stand up in front of the whole town council, and I am going to present my qualifications and my record, and I am going to ask them, plainly and quietly, what it is they are actually afraid of. And then I am going to keep working, because that is what I came here to do. Silas looked at his sister, really looked, the way a person looks at someone they have known their whole life and still finds new things in. He said, You know what I admire most about you? Tell me. That you are afraid too, every time, and you do it anyway. Eden looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation. Silas laughed. It was a good sound in a quiet house. He came back on Thursday as instructed. He arrived precisely at the time she had specified,
8:30, which suggested he'd thought about it beforehand, though he would not have said so. He sat in the chair with the same deliberate, unconceding quality as before, and he extended his arm without being asked, which was, she decided, the closest thing to cooperation she was likely to get from Matthias Decker. The stitches were clean, the wound had closed well, the burn was healing without infection, which meant he had actually kept it dry, which meant he listened, which meant, she filed this away without comment. "Good," she said. "Another 4 days and I can take the stitches out. Tuesday then. Tuesday." She redressed the burn. He was watching her work again with that same quality of attention he probably gave everything, the forge, the iron, the particular angle of a hammer blow. She found it less uncomfortable this time, which unsettled her slightly. "I heard about the petition." Eden's hands did not pause. "Did you sign it?" "No." She looked at him. His face gave nothing away. "Why not?" she asked, because she was a doctor, and curiosity in her was not a social habit, but a diagnostic reflex. "Because you sewed me up properly, and because what a person does with their needle matters more than what's between their ears about it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the most practical endorsement I've ever received." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, adjacent to a smile. "Don't make too much of it." "I wouldn't dream of it." A pause. The clinic was quiet. Through the front window, Main Street went about its business in the thin October light. "Clara Aldred," he said. "She wants to bring Tommy in, but she's—" He stopped. Started again. "Her husband Abe is one of the ones who signed the petition. He doesn't want her to. But the boy's cough is worse." A beat. "I told her what you said." Eden was very careful with her voice. "And?" "He asked if you were any good." He looked at her directly. "I told her you were the one who could answer that." Eden thought of a boy with a nighttime cough and a chest that wasn't right, and felt the particular weight that settles on a physician when a case goes from hypothetical to actual. "If she wants to bring him," she said carefully, "I'll see him at any hour, morning, evening, whatever is easiest for her." "I'll tell her." He rose from the chair, flexed the hand carefully, and seemed satisfied with how it moved. "The hand feels better." "The nerve was not affected. You were lucky." She paused. "Come back Tuesday, I'll take the stitches out." "I know," you said, but he said it without sharpness. He said it almost as though he would remember. He left. Eden stood at the window and watched him cross the street, shoulders broad and straight, moving through the town the way he always moved, like someone who belongs to it without belonging to it, present and alone at the same time. She turned back to her work. She told herself she did not keep thinking about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon. She was a reasonably credible liar when the audience was herself, but even she found this one difficult. Eden wore blue to the council meeting, not as a concession. She had considered briefly whether to wear the red coat again, as a statement, as a refusal to be managed, and had decided against it not because she was afraid, but because a council meeting was not an argument. It was an argument that required clarity, not color. Blue was her most professional dress, the one she wore in Philadelphia when she needed to be seen as a physician first and everything else second.
The meeting was held in the town hall, which smelled of candle wax and old decisions, and which was, when Eden arrived, already more than half full. News of the petition had done its work. Half of Harrowfield had come to watch what happened, in the way that people attend things they are curious about, but will later deny having been interested in. She sat in the front row, alone, because Silas had offered to come, and she had told him this was hers to do. She sat straight-backed and quiet while the council settled, while Mayor Clendon called the meeting to order, while the petition was read aloud in the flat, procedural voice of the town clerk. When her name was called, she stood. She had prepared remarks. She had prepared them carefully because she believed in preparation and in the power of words chosen deliberately rather than reached for in the moment of pressure. But when she stood and looked at the room, at the faces turned toward her, some hostile, some conflicted, some carefully neutral, she found herself setting the prepared remarks aside. "I'm not going to read you my credentials," she said.
You have them, the mayor has them, they are real and they are considerable, and they are not the point. She paused. The point is that 14 months ago, you lost your doctor, and in that time, 3 of your children died. A man lost 2 fingers. How many of you have conditions that have been untreated because there was no one to treat them? How many of you have been hoping the pain or the cough or the swelling would resolve on its own because the alternative was a 3-day ride to the nearest physician? She looked around the room. I am that alternative. I am here, I am trained, and I want nothing more than to do the work I was called to do. Called, said Agnes Turnbow from the middle of the room. Her voice was not unkind, precisely, but it had the particular quality of a challenge dressed as a question. That's an interesting word for a woman to use about doctoring. I mean it precisely, said Eden. I believe this is the work God gave me. I have believed that since I was 12 years old, and I watched a physician save my father's life with knowledge and skill and steadiness, and I thought that is what I want to do. I want to be the person in the room who knows what to do. She was quiet for a moment. I have spent 12 years becoming that person. I did not come here to prove anything to you. I came here because you need a doctor, and I am one. What happens between us after that is between us. But turning me away now means the next child who gets a fever in February waits, and we all know what waiting costs. The room was silent. And then, from near the back, a sound Eden did not expect. A chair scraped. Matthias Decker stood up. He was not a man who made speeches. This was understood by everyone in the room, including Matthias himself. He stood with his arms at his sides and his left hand wrapped in clean linen, the dressing Eden had put on 3 days ago, and he looked at Mayor Clendon with the directness of a man who has been working with fire long enough to have no patience for the secondary burn of social complication. He put 14 stitches in my arm last week, clean, sound, no sign of infection. He held up the dressed hand. That's a 2nd-degree burn underneath there that is healing correctly because she dressed it correctly the first time. He sat down. That was all he said. But Harrowfield understood the language of Matthias Decker. When a man who praises nothing praises something, it carries the specific gravity of a thing said once and meant absolutely. The silence in the room changed its quality. When the vote was called, the petition failed. 6-2. Mayor Clendon himself voted against it. Eden walked home through the October night with the stars vast above Harrowfield and her heart very full, and her face, in the darkness, allowing itself an expression she would not have shown in the lit room, a brief, fierce, private relief. She had not looked at Matthias Decker when he sat down. She had been afraid that if she looked at him, something would show in her face that she was not ready to have visible.
He came on Tuesday as promised to have the stitches removed. He sat in the chair. He extended his arm. He watched her work. He said very little. She removed the stitches with small, neat scissor movements and the kind of focus that is its own kind of conversation. The wound had healed better than she had expected, a thin, pale line that would, in a year, be almost invisible. She told him so. The burn? He asked. Another week of dressing it. Come back Saturday and I'll see if we can leave it open. She folded the last piece of removed suture into a cloth. You kept it dry. You told me to. People often don't. I said I would. She looked at him. He said this not as a boast, but as a simple fact about himself. He did what he said he would do. It was, she thought, the kind of sentence that sounds simple and is not simple at all. Saturday then, she said. Saturday. He rose. He took his hat. At the door, he paused. That pause she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was working out whether to say something. Clara Aldred will be bringing Tommy in this afternoon. She asks me to tell you. Her husband doesn't know. Eden felt the weight of this. I'll be ready, she said. She's frightened. Not of you, of what you might find. I know the difference, said Eden quietly. He nodded.
left. She spent the rest of the morning preparing. Clara Aldred arrived at 3 o'clock with her son, who was small for 8 and had the particular exhausted quality of a child who has not slept well for a long time. He had dark eyes and his mother's careful, watchful face, and he looked at Eden's clinic with the wary curiosity of a child who has been told to be brave and is being brave, but would very much like someone to notice. "Hello, Tommy," said Eden. "Do you know what a stethoscope does?" "Listens to your heart," said Tommy. "That's right. Do you want to try it on yourself first? You can listen to your own heart before I do." Tommy's eyes went wide. He looked at his mother. Clara Aldred was watching Eden with a complicated expression of a woman who has spent too long in fear and does not quite trust the thing in front of her that looks like hope. But she nodded. Tommy listened to his own heart. "It goes fast," he said, with the pleased authority of a child who has learned something. "Faster than mine, yes," said Eden. "Children's hearts beat faster. That's perfectly correct." She held out her hand for the stethoscope. "My turn?" He gave it to her. He sat very still. Eden listened to Tommy Aldred's heart and then his lungs, and the thing she heard was a thing she had heard before and did not like hearing, which was the sound of fluid where there should be clear air, of a body doing its determined, limited best against something that was winning the slow, quiet battle. She kept her face carefully pleasant. She was very good at this. When she had finished her examination, she sent Tommy to look at the glass case of instruments while she spoke to Clara in low tones. Clara Aldred, who was 31 but looked older, who had a goodness in her face that difficulty had not erased but only deepened, listened with her hands gripped together and her eyes very bright and very dry, the eyes of a woman who has been saving her crying for somewhere private. "He has fluid in the right lung. I believe there's a chronic infection there that has not been treated because it has not been properly diagnosed. This is not a simple cough, Clara, but it is treatable. I need to be very clear with you. It is treatable, and with the right medicine and care, Tommy can recover, but he needs treatment now, not in the spring, not when it's more convenient, now." Clara Aldred was silent for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was very steady and very small, "My husband won't allow it." "I know." Eden held her gaze. "What will you allow, Clara?" Clara looked at her son, who was examining the instruments with the concentrated delight of a small boy encountering interesting objects. She looked at him for a long time. "Whatever he needs," she said. "Whatever my boy needs." He came on Saturday. The burn was healing. She pronounced it well enough to leave undressed, reminded him to keep it clean, told him he was done, no more required visits. He sat in the chair for a moment after she said this, not rising immediately, which she noticed. "The boy, Tommy, how is he?" "I can't discuss my patients with—" "I know that," he said, not impatient, just acknowledging the fact. "I'm asking how he is as a question from a neighbor, not as a medical inquiry." Eden considered this distinction. "She came to see me," she said carefully. "I gave her mother something to help with the cough at night." Matthias looked at her. He understood this. He was, she had come to understand, a person who heard the things between words. "Is it serious?" he asked. "I cannot—" "Eden," her name in his voice for the first time, not Dr. Hargrove, not Miss Hargrove, just Eden, plainly said as though he had been saying it for years. "Is it serious?"
She met his eyes, held them. "Yes," she said, "but treatable, if the treatment is allowed to continue." Something happened in his face, a tightening, then a deliberate loosening, the expression of a man mastering a feeling that he has not been asked about and is not going to display. "What do you need?" "A father who will let his son be treated." "Abe Aldred." He said the name flatly. "He signed the petition." "I know he did." A pause. "I'll talk to him." Eden stared at him. "You'll talk to—" "I'll talk to him." He said it with the same tone he used for everything, not loud, not aggressive, but with the absolute unstoppable solidity of iron meeting the correct temperature, as if the thing was decided because he had said it. And here, Here was the thing that Eden Hargrove had not expected. Not the offer, not the willingness, but the quiet fury beneath it, the controlled, compressed thing moving behind his dark eyes that said, "This boy matters to me, and I will not sit by." She sat with this for a moment. "Matthias," she said, and her own use of his given name surprised her slightly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. He rose from the chair. He took his hat. "That's not why I'm doing it." He left. Eden stood in the middle of her clinic and felt something she was not entirely sure she had the right to feel yet, which was the sensation of someone standing between her and the difficulty. Not to remove the difficulty. She would never want the difficulty removed. She had fought too hard for the right to face it herself, but simply to stand there, solid and unmovable, in case the difficulty tried something unfair. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the examination table. "Oh," she said, to no one in particular. And then she stood up, straightened her coat, and went back to work. No one was present for the conversation between Matthias Decker and Abraham Aldred, which took place the following Monday morning at the Aldred farm, so what passed between them belongs to inference and afterward. What was inferred came from several sources, from the fact that Abe Aldred arrived at the clinic on Tuesday morning, hat in hand, asking to speak to Dr. Hargrove, from the fact that he was a big, sun-weathered man who moved like someone carrying something heavier than himself, and who could not quite meet Eden's eyes when he sat down, from the fact that he said, without preamble, "My wife says our boy is sick, really sick. She says you know what to do for him." He stopped. "I signed that petition." "I know," said Eden. "I was wrong to." He said it like a man pulling a splinter from his own palm, not because it is pleasant, but because it needs to come out. "Matthias told me about his arm. He told me what you did." He paused. "He said you were the best pair of hands in the territory, and that if I let my pride get my son killed, I would spend the rest of my life knowing I had a choice." Eden was very quiet. "Is he right?" Abe asked. "Can you help Tommy?" "I believe so. I cannot promise outcomes, no honest physician can, but I can tell you that the treatment I want to use is the correct one, and that without it, the infection in Tommy's lung will advance and become something much harder to manage." She met his eyes steadily. "I need your permission, Mr. Aldred, and I need Tommy to come to me every other day for the next 3 weeks. I need you to trust me." The word trust sat in the air between them. Abe Aldred looked at his hat. He looked at the clean floor of the clinic, and the organized shelves and the certificates on the wall, and the plain, steady face of the woman across from him. "My wife trusts you," he said finally. "She's usually right about people." He stood. "I'll bring him tomorrow morning, first light." "I'll be here," Eden said. He went to the door, stopped, did not turn around. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the petition." "Thank you for coming today. That matters more." He left. Eden stood in the middle of her clinic and felt something she was not entirely sure she had the right to feel yet, which was the sensation of someone standing between her and the difficulty. Not to remove the difficulty. She would never want the difficulty removed. She had fought too hard for the right to face it herself. But simply to stand there, solid and unmovable, in case the difficulty tried something unfair. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the examination table. "Oh," she said, to no one in particular, and then she stood up, straightened her coat, and went back to work. Tommy Aldred came every other day as agreed, and he improved, and then in the 3rd week, he got worse. It happened quickly and without warning, the way these things do when the body runs out of reserves, and the infection, which has been retreating, decides instead to rally. On a Wednesday evening in November, with snow threatening in the low clouds over the territory, and the wind making something mournful in the eaves of the clinic, Tommy Aldred began to struggle to breathe. Clara brought him in at 10 o'clock at night, wrapped in a quilt, her face the color of ash. Eden had been awake. She had developed the habit of staying in the clinic late, nominally to read, functionally because sleep was harder to come by than she would have admitted. She took one look at Tommy and felt the focused, cold clarity that descends on her in a true emergency. Everything irrelevant vanishes. The world reduces to the body in front of her and what it needs, and she becomes simply the work. "Clara, I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I say,"
Eden said, moving already. He has a pleural effusion, fluid pressing on the lung. I need to drain it. This is a procedure I have done many times and I can do it safely, but I need silence and I need light, and I need you to hold his hand and talk to him. Will he... Clara began. Clara? Eden's voice was gentle and absolutely firm. I need you with me now, not in that other place. She held her eyes until she saw her come back, the panic pushed down by sheer maternal will. Good. Now tell me, has he eaten today? The procedure was performed by lamplight, which was not ideal, and in a clinic that was good enough but not what a proper hospital would have provided, which was not ideal also, and by a woman alone at 10 o'clock on a November night in a small town that had spent the last month arguing about whether she should be here at all. She did not think about any of these things. She thought about the needle, and the angle, and Tommy's small, frightened breathing, and Clara's voice above him saying his name gently and telling him about the time he was 3 years old and found a baby rabbit in the yard. The whole story in a low, steady murmur that Eden was grateful for as she worked. She drained the effusion, she administered the medicine, she wrapped him in clean blankets and settled him on the cot in the back room, and sat beside him for 2 hours until his breathing had steadied and deepened into sleep, proper sleep, the sleep of a body that has been given back enough room to breathe. When she came back to the front room, Clara was sitting with her hands over her face, and Matthias Decker was standing in the open doorway. He had not been summoned, he was simply there, the way he sometimes seemed to be there, as though the thing that needed him had called him without using words. His coat was on over his work clothes, as though he came quickly, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before. A rawness, a stripped-back quality, the look of a man standing outside a door, not knowing what was happening inside. He's sleeping, Eden said. He's going to be all right. Clara Aldred let out a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a prayer, and was entirely both. She pressed her hands tighter against her face. Matthias Decker looked at Eden. He looked at her for a moment with that face that she could not entirely read, that face of compressed feeling and iron control, and then something in it broke, very quietly, like a seam splits in something that has been under too much pressure for too long. Not dramatic, not loud, but just a small, true, irreversible change. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Small words, the smallest available, but he said them with everything he had, which was considerable, and Eden felt them land somewhere in her chest with the kind of weight that does not easily lift again. You're welcome, she said. And then, because the night had been long and difficult and she was tired, and because he was standing in her doorway at midnight with that look on his face, she said without quite deciding to, thank you, for talking to Abe, for making it possible. He was very still. That's not... He stopped. That's not what? She asked softly. He looked at her for a long, charged moment. Then he looked away, out at the dark street, and when he looked back, the seam had been pressed closed again, and his face was its usual controlled thing, but different. Something had shifted behind it that could not shift back. Nothing, he said. I'll come by in the morning to check on him. He stepped back from the doorway. Get some rest, doctor.
He disappeared into the dark. Eden stood in her doorway and looked at the empty street and felt the November wind and thought that she was very, very far from Philadelphia, and that this was, somehow, exactly where she was supposed to be. Tommy recovered. Over the following 2 weeks, he recovered steadily and completely in the determined, total way that healthy children recover when given the correct treatment and the correct amount of their mother's cooking and the incorrect but deeply therapeutic amount of their father's guilt, manifesting as extra helpings of everything and a new set of carved wooden horses. Abe Aldred, who had the grace to be wholly changed by the experience of nearly losing his son through his own stubbornness, came to the clinic 3 days after Tommy's crisis and sat in the patient's chair and said, I owe you an apology that's bigger than the one I already gave you. I know that. You brought him in, Eden said. That's what matters. I almost didn't, but you did. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Aldred, I have been doing this long enough to know that most people's resistance to me is not about me at all. It's about what they're afraid of. I stopped taking it personally a long time ago. A pause. Well, mostly.
Something close to a smile moved across Abe Aldred's face. My wife says you're the best thing that's happened to this town in years. Your wife is very perceptive. She is, he agreed. She usually is. He rose. At the door, Matthias Decker, are you two... He stopped. Eden looked at him. Never mind, said Abe, with the expression of a man who has just asked a question he immediately regretted. Good day, doctor. He left quickly. Eden stood in her clinic for a moment and thought that the conversation she was apparently not having with Matthias Decker had become perceptible to people other than herself, which was inconvenient. The problem, or rather the problem among problems, the one that sat at the center of everything, was this. She was becoming fond of Harrowfield. Not in the way she had expected to become fond of it, which was the detached, professional fondness of a doctor for the community she serves. She was becoming fond of it in the much more dangerous way, the way of specific things, the sound of the church bell on Sunday mornings, Ruth Clendon's increasingly frank conversation over tea, the woman relaxing into herself as the medication was adjusted and the headaches lessened, Silas's obvious, uncomplicated happiness with his animals, Pastor Webb's steady, unhurried wisdom, little Tommy bringing her a carved horse from his new set, wrapped in a piece of calico, delivered with the solemn formality of a child making a grand gesture, and the blacksmith, the hammer at night, the Tuesday and Saturday appearances that had technically ended, but somehow had not, the way he left space for her in conversations, the particular quality of his attention, which was, she had come to understand, not the attention of a man cataloging a curiosity, but of one who was listening for something he could not quite bring himself to ask for. She thought about him more than was medically indicated. She thought about him, specifically, in the context of Proverbs, a passage she had read in her childhood and returned to in adulthood with growing understanding. Iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens another. She thought about how that worked, how something hard and unyielding meets something hard and unyielding, and both are made more useful, more refined, more precisely themselves. She thought about what it would mean in her life as she had built it, the life of a doctor, a professional, a woman who had sacrificed considerable amounts of comfort and convention for the right to practice medicine, to add to it the complication of a man who had 14 stitches in his arm and could not quite look at her without something happening in his face. She thought these things and then she went back to work, because work was what she had. December came in cold and clear and full of the particular silence of the territory in winter, when the land takes a deep breath and holds it. He came to the clinic on a Friday evening, which was not a scheduled appointment day, which meant he had come for a reason that was not medical. Eden saw him through the window, standing on the step, and the knowledge that his reason was not medical settled into her chest with the weight of something long anticipated. She opened the door. "The clinic is closing," she said, not to turn him away, as an observation, as a way of saying, the professional context is setting, what comes next is something else. "He knows," he said. He came in. The clinic in the evening had a different quality than the clinic during the day. Quieter, the lamplight warmer, the busyness of medicine packed away for the night. He sat in the patient's chair, which was, Eden thought, a habit that outlasted any medical occasion. "I have something I need to say," he said. He said it looking at his hands, which were still work-roughened, still capable, still bearing the fine scar along the left arm that she had made and he had healed. "All right," said Eden. "I have been..." He stopped. Started again. "I said things about you before you came. When the mayor told people a doctor was arriving, I said it was foolishness." He looked up at her. "I was wrong." "You're aware that you..." "I was wrong," he said again, simply, and she understood that he was not asking her to dispute this or to soften it for him. He was stating a fact about himself and taking the full weight of it, which is what this man did with things. She let it sit. "I was wrong about a lot of things," he said. "About what a woman can do, about what I thought of doctors, about..." He stopped again. The lamplight lay across his face, and she could see the effort in him, not the effort of a hard man going soft, which would have been a lesser thing, but the effort of a strong man learning to do something new with his strength. "Eden," said Eden carefully, "what are you..." "I would like to walk out with you." He said, abruptly, directly, the way he did everything. "If you're willing, if that's something you—" He stopped. Something naked crossed his face, and he looked at the floor. "I don't know what to say beyond that. I've been thinking about it for 2 months, and that's all I have." The quiet in the clinic had the quality of held breath. Eden looked at him for a long time, at the scar on his arm and the roughness of his hands, and the line of his jaw that was exactly as unmovable as reported, and at the thing behind his eyes that was not unmovable at all. "I came here to be a doctor," she said. "That doesn't change, not for anything." "I know that," he said. "I drive my own buggy. I wear whatever color I choose." "I know that too." A slight, reluctant pause, "though I'm not sure about the red." She stared at him. Then she saw the corner of his mouth, that almost there thing that was his version of humor, and something unlocked in her chest, and she laughed, actually laughed, and it surprised both of them. "The red," she said, "is non-negotiable." "I was afraid of that," he said. The laughter settled. They looked at each other in the lamplight of the clinic, the doctor and the blacksmith, 2 people who had been sharpening against each other for 3 months and were both, in their different ways, more precisely themselves for it. "Yes," said Eden. "Yes?" "Yes," she said again. "I'll walk out with you." A pause. "And Matthias, thank you for being wrong and for saying so. That took more than you know." He looked at her with that steady, dark gaze. "It took less than I thought," he said, "once I actually decided to." Harrowfield noticed. Of course it noticed. It was a small town in December with limited entertainment options and 2 people who were extremely bad at being inconspicuous, though for different reasons. Eden because she had never tried to be inconspicuous in her life, and Matthias because he was the kind of person it is simply impossible not to notice, like a mountain or a weather system. They were seen walking after church on a Sunday, which was notable. They were seen at the general store together, which was remarked upon. Agnes Turnbow told 3 people that she had always suspected the blacksmith and the doctor were well matched in stubbornness, and someone had to keep that man in line. Ruth Clendon said nothing, but she smiled more than was strictly necessary for several days. Silas said, "I approve. He looks at you like the forge looks at iron, completely." "That is either very romantic or extremely alarming," said Eden. "With Matthias Decker," said Silas, "I believe those things are the same." He was probably right. Pastor Webb, when Eden came to ask his opinion, not of the relationship itself, but of the general situation, which was her way of asking about the relationship itself, said that he has been watching that man for 15 years. He has been waiting for something worth opening himself for. He didn't know that's what he was doing, but I knew.
"What if I'm not—" Eden began. "You are," said Pastor Webb serenely. "You don't know what I was going to say." "I have a reasonable idea," said the pastor, "and the answer is still yes." Eden looked at him. "Do you always do that?" 15 years of pastoring," he said. "You learn when to let people finish their sentences and when the sentence they need to finish is already written in their face." He smiled. "Go home, Dr. Hargrove, and stop worrying about whether you deserve to be happy. You are already healing this town. You are allowed to be healed yourself." December deepened. The headaches, Ruth Clendon's headaches, which had been the first small crack in the wall, continued to diminish, which pleased Eden medically, and which appeared to be having a secondary effect that she had not prescribed. Ruth Clendon was becoming, with great determination and at increasing volume, one of Eden's most forceful advocates. She told Agnes Turnbow, Ruth reported to Eden one afternoon over tea, with a satisfaction that was not quite unbecoming, that any woman who can manage both a petition campaign and a December headache deserves a medal. I told her that was quite right, and that both problems had been resolved by the same doctor, and that she might want to reconsider her position on the matter. What did Agnes say? She said that she had always believed in competent doctoring, whatever the source. That's remarkably evolved of her. She also said that you seemed a very sensible young woman, and that someone ought to see to it that you had a proper winter coat before January. Eden stared. Then she began to laugh, and Ruth Clendon laughed too, and there was a warmth in that cold afternoon kitchen that had nothing to do with the stove.
These were the things Eden had not expected. The friendship of women she had expected to oppose her, the gentleness of a town coming around, the way trust, once earned, compounds. The mother who brought her child now brought her neighbor, who brought her sister, who brought her elderly father, who told everyone at the barber shop that the lady doctor had fixed his knee and he could get up the port stairs without wanting to die. The clinic was busy now. Not overwhelmingly, it was a small town, but steadily, purposefully busy. Eden was doing the work she had come to do, and the work was real, and it was hers. She thought sometimes in quiet moments about all the places she had not been wanted. The medical school that had tried to redirect her to nursing, the hospital that had given her a closet for an office, the colleagues who had watched her work and assumed, despite all evidence, that she would eventually grow tired of it. She thought about those places and those people and felt something she did not entirely expect. Not bitterness, but a kind of gratitude. Because every refusal had refined her. Every closed door had sent her through a different one. And this particular door in Harrowfield, Oklahoma territory, on the edge of everything, this one had been worth all of them. He made her something. She did not know he was making it until it appeared on the doorstep of the clinic one morning in mid-December, wrapped in brown paper with no card. But she knew who had made it because there was only one person in Harrowfield who worked in iron, and the item, when she unwrapped it, was made with the particular craft of someone who had spent considerable time and effort on something that had no commercial value whatsoever. It was a sign. A small iron sign, beautifully made, with her name in letters he had hand-formed letter by letter, Dr. Eden Hargrove, M.D., and below the name, a small rod and serpent, the caduceus, shaped so precisely from a single piece of iron that it looked as though it had grown rather than been made. She stood in the doorway holding it for a long time. Later, she would hang it by the door, and it would stay there for the rest of her time in Harrowfield, and then travel with her, that sign, through every place she ever practiced and every door she ever hung it beside, and people would always ask about it, who had made it, why, the story behind it, and she would always smile and say that she had a friend who was good with iron. That afternoon, she walked to the forge. She had never come to him before. He was at the iron when she arrived in the shop, working, coatless despite the cold, in the way of men who make their own heat, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway of the shop, and something in his face went very still in the particular way that means a person is intensely alert. "The sign," she said. She was holding it. "I thought," he began. "It's beautiful," she said, quietly, directly, the way she did everything. "Thank you." He looked at her. The forge glowed behind him, and the smoke rose through the chimney into the December sky, and Harrowfield went about its business at a slight, tactful remove. "The caduceus took me 3 tries," he said. "It's perfect." "I'm glad." He said it simply. Then, "Will you come in out of the cold?" She came in out of the cold. She stayed for an hour. He showed her how the forge worked, not because she asked, but because she was clearly curious, and he, she had come to understand, was a man who opened himself gradually, by demonstration, who said everything most important with his hands. She watched him work a piece of iron, watched the heat and the hammer, and the transformation of something rigid and resistant into something shaped and purposeful, and she thought about iron sharpening iron, and about the various meanings of that phrase. Does it ever frustrate you when it won't take the shape you want? He considered this. You can't force iron. If you try to force it before it's ready, it cracks. You have to wait for the right temperature. Then it goes where you want. He glanced at her. Some things are like that. Some things, Eden said. Most things worth making, he said. She walked home in the December dusk with the sign under her arm and his words in her head, and the particular, inconvenient, absolute warmth of knowing she was loved, even if neither of them had said the word yet, even if the word was still being heated to the right temperature, knowing it like you know certain things not because they've been announced, but because they are simply, undeniably present. Christmas in Harrowfield was the kind of Christmas that small towns in the territory knew how to make. Not extravagant, not costly, but assembled with the fierce, particular care of people who understand that beauty is not something that arrives fully formed, but something that is built together from whatever materials are at hand. There were candles in every window on Christmas Eve. There was pine and cedar from the ridgeline above town, and paper stars that the school children had made and hung from every available hook and rafter in the church. There was a choir of 8 people who could carry a tune, led by Pastor Webb with the conviction of a man who believes singing is a form of prayer, which is why it needs to be done fully and without self-consciousness. Eden sat in the second pew, with Silas beside her, and Matthias at the end of the row. He had appeared there without discussion, simply sat down, as though this was the obvious and only arrangement. And she listened to the choir and the pastor, and looked at the paper stars, and felt the kind of peace that does not require anything to be perfect, that exists alongside the imperfect and the difficult, and the unresolved, and is somehow larger than all of it. Pastor Webb's Christmas sermon was about what the incarnation means, in practical terms, that God did not observe human need from a safe distance, but entered it completely, got cold, got tired, got hungry, stood in doorways where he might not be wanted, and offered what he had to give. The question the incarnation asks us, Webb said, his gray eyes quiet and serious, is what do you believe, but what are you willing to enter? What are you willing to bring your whole self to, knowing you might not be received, knowing you might have to do the work before you earn the welcome? Eden felt Matthias very still beside her. She looked at her hands in her lap. Afterward, in the cold air outside the church, with the stars overhead and the whole town moving in small, warm clusters, Matthias said quietly, "Walk with me." They walked, away from the warmth and the light, along the edge of town where the land opened up into the dark territory sky, that sky that was so much larger here than anywhere Eden had lived before, that sky that required a kind of reckoning with your own size. "My wife," he stopped. It was the first time he had mentioned her. Eden waited. "She left because I didn't know how to—" He stopped again, and Eden could see the effort this was, could see the iron-willed man asking himself to be temporarily less iron and more human, which for him was the bravest thing. "I put everything into the work and left nothing for anything else. I told myself that was just how I was made, and that anyone who couldn't accommodate it was the wrong person for me. And then she left, and I decided she was right." He was quiet. "I decided that I was the kind of man who stays alone, and that this was acceptable." "And now?" Eden asked softly. He turned to look at her. In the darkness, with the stars tremendous above them and the distant light of Harrowfield behind them, his face was open in a way that she suspected very few people had ever seen it. "And now," he said, "I don't want that to be true anymore." A pause. "You showed up in red, and you sewed me up, and you saved a boy, and you stood in front of the whole town and said what needed saying, and I realized that the reason I couldn't look away from you on that first Tuesday wasn't what I told myself it was." He looked at her steadily. "It was because I recognized something. I recognized a person who does not flinch, who gives everything to the thing they're called to, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" Eden said. Her voice was very quiet. "I thought, there, that is what it looks like when a person is living exactly as they were made to." The silence between them was full and still. "Matthias," Eden said. She said his name with everything, with all the months of his Tuesday appointments and his hammer at night, and the sign with the caduceus, and the way he had stood up in that meeting and said 14 stitches and meant so much more than 14 stitches. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. I just wanted you to know." "You wanted me to know," she said, "that you love me." He looked at her without flinching. "Yes." She took one step closer to him, which in the territory night felt like a large and deliberate and irrevocable act, and she said,
I love you too. And I am not saying that to manage the situation. I am saying it because it is true and because I have been not saying it for about 2 months, and I am a doctor and I have very limited patience for withholding information that is clinically relevant. He looked at her for a moment as though processing this. Then, finally, completely, with the full weight of who he was, Matthias Decker smiled. It was not a small thing when it came. It was the smile of a man who has been keeping that particular thing stored for a long time and releasing it all at once. It transformed his face. It made him look, she thought, like what he actually was underneath all that iron, a man who was capable of great tenderness and had been waiting, maybe for years, for someone who could stand close enough to the heat to see it. Clinically relevant, he said. Very, said Eden. He took her hand, just that, her hand in both of his, warm despite the cold, and they stood together in the enormous dark under the enormous stars, two stubborn, capable, necessary people, and the territory held them as though it had been expecting them all along. They were married in the spring, which surprised no one and delighted almost everyone, including Agnes Turnbow, who made the most elaborate wedding dress that had been seen in the territory in a decade and refused to accept payment for it on the grounds that she owed Dr. Hargrove at least a dress, having nearly cost her the town. Eden kept the clinic. Of course she kept the clinic. She was Dr. Eden Decker after the wedding, which sounded different, but meant the same things: training and skill and steadiness, and the absolute refusal to let the people in her care be failed by anyone's comfort, including her own. Matthias kept the forge. He was changed by it. Or rather, he was more completely himself for it, the way iron is more precisely itself after the hammer. He was still difficult, he was still large and dark, and inclined to communicate in silences and small, significant actions rather than words. But the silences had a different quality now, and the actions were directed differently, and 3 people in Harrowfield, Eden and Silas and Tommy Aldred, who appointed himself the blacksmith's honorary apprentice, knew that inside the iron was fire, and that the fire was enormous. Tommy Aldred grew up healthy, strong, taller than his father, with clear lungs and a habit of visiting the clinic on his way to the forge, so that some days Eden and Matthias had a shadow that followed them through most of the morning. He became, eventually, a physician himself, trained in the East and returned to the territory. He said in his first commencement speech that his inspiration was a woman who arrived in his town when he was 8 years old, wearing red and carrying a black bag, and who had looked at everything Harrowfield thought it believed and simply, without drama, loved people better than they knew how to be loved until they learned. Pastor Webb christened their first child on a Sunday morning in winter, with the snow deep outside the church and the candles lit, and the congregation, all of Harrowfield more or less, arranged in the pews in a particular way of a community that has come not just to witness, but to claim a thing as their own. The child was a girl. They named her Grace. She grew up with iron and medicine in her blood, and everyone said she had her mother's eyes and her father's spine, and her own entirely original way of looking at a problem, which was to walk straight toward it without flinching and ask it plainly what it was afraid of. When people asked Eden in later years how she had managed it, the resistance, the hostility, the isolation and the fear, and the long, difficult work of being believed before she was believed, she would always say the same thing. "I was called," she said. "I knew I was called, and when you know you're called, the place you're sent to and the difficulty of it and the people who can't yet see you, those things become part of the calling, not obstacles to it. You don't go around the hard thing, you go through it, and you find on the other side that the hard thing was not your enemy." "What was it?" people asked. "The refinement," she would say, "the thing that made me who I needed to be. Iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens another,
And in a small town at the edge of the territory, with the stars overhead and the forge glowing and the clinic open and a girl named Grace growing up between medicine and fire, the Lord had made something worth making out of what had seemed on a Tuesday in autumn like a terrible mistake. It was not a mistake. It was never a mistake. It was the plan. Friends, if this story moved your heart, if you felt Eden's courage or Matthias's slow, beautiful breaking open, or the quiet faithfulness of a town learning to be better, then you know why we do this. Every story on this channel is a reminder that God wastes nothing. Not your struggle, not your waiting, not the doors that closed, not the people who doubted you. He uses all of it. He shapes all of it. He is the craftsman at the forge of your life, and he is working you, even now, into exactly what you need to be. Subscribe to the Blessed Christian Storyteller, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and come back for the next one, because the stories are not over. They never are. God bless you. We will see you in the next story.